The flash of a camera exploded in Lara's face before she even stepped out of the elevator. Her white coat, still stained with a fading streak of dried blood, glowed under the hospital's fluorescent lights like evidence on display. In the reflection of the glass doors, she saw herself as the world now saw her, a young doctor with hollow eyes, a trembling jaw, and a reputation crushed in 24 hours. Security tried to push the journalists back, but their voices still pierced through the chaotic lobby. They weren't asking questions, they were throwing accusations wrapped as headlines. Doctor who ignored protocol, reckless newcomer, the miracle that turned into a scandal. Every word lodged into her skin like a splinter, and the worst part was that none of them knew what had really happened in Operating Room 6. They only knew the version that had been leaked, edited, and twisted to fit a story people could hate before breakfast. Lara kept walking, eyes fixed on the floor, breath measured in careful doses, the way she taught her patients to inhale before a procedure. She was 29, chief resident in trauma surgery, the youngest in the hospital's history, and yet today she moved like someone twice her age, dragging the weight of a reputation that seemed too heavy for her shoulders. Nurses at the station fell silent as she passed. One of them, who used to greet her with coffee during night shifts, shifted her gaze to the computer screen as if Lara had turned invisible. Scripts of loyalty rewrote themselves in seconds when the internet decided who was safe to stand next to. The hospital board had chosen the conference room on the top floor, the one with glass on three sides and a view of the city that felt almost cruel on days like this. Lara walked in and found them already seated, the medical director, two board members, the head of legal, and a man from PR whose smile never reached his eyes. Her chair was deliberately placed at the short end of the table, slightly away, as if even furniture could express judgment. No one stood to greet her. They only waited, pens ready, screens glowing, like they were about to take notes on the ruins of her career. The medical director, Dr. Enrique Moretti, finally looked up from a file thick with printed pages and screenshots. He had taught her how to suture arteries when her hands still shook. Now his gaze was measured, distant, as if he had to choose between protecting the hospital and remembering that she had once been his best resident. He started talking about institutional image, public confidence, and risk management, words that sounded sterile and perfectly disinfected, while the images spreading online were anything but clean. Somewhere between those terms, her name came up, stripped of the warmth and respect with which he used to say it. They walked through the case step by step, but not the way she remembered it. They spoke of unauthorized decision-making and breach of protocol, as if she had casually gambled with a life. No one mentioned the moment when the patient's blood pressure disappeared from the monitor like a dropped signal, or how the senior surgeon froze for a heartbeat too long, or how Lara, in that crack of time, chose to cut open a chest to save a man who had already started slipping away. No one mentioned that, according to every algorithm, that man should already be dead. They had the footage, the operating room camera saw everything. But the segments circulating online were neatly edited, taking milliseconds of hesitation and stretching them into a narrative of incompetence. Lara listened without interrupting, fingers pressed so tightly around the pen in her hand that her knuckles turned pale. Every instinct inside her wanted to stand up and defend herself, to describe the smell of cautery and adrenaline, the way the room had narrowed down to a pulse line and a decision that couldn't wait for a committee vote. But the boardroom was not a place for visceral truth. It was a place where outcomes were converted into risk, and risk was converted into distance. So she stayed still and let their version of events layer over her memory like fog. When they finally asked if she had anything to say, she forced herself to meet their eyes. She explained the sequence as she lived it, her voice steady but low, like a surgeon recounting a loss at morbidity and mortality rounds. She didn't cry, not here, not in front of them. She talked about seconds, about the absence of a supervising surgeon when she called, about the paramedics' report that was missing in the initial file. She spoke with the precision that had earned her respect on the night shift, detailing vital signs, doses of medication, and the exact instant she realized that if she didn't act, there would be no patient left to argue about. There was a moment of silence afterward, heavy and fragile. For 1 second, Lara almost believed that the truth might be enough. That someone at the table would remember the dozens of lives she had helped save, the families who had hugged her in corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. But then the legal advisor cleared his throat and shifted the conversation back to damage control. The board couldn't deny that she had talent. They couldn't deny that the patient was alive, breathing in an ICU bed 3 floors below them. But they also couldn't deny the videos, the trending hashtag with her name attached to it, the angry posts accusing the hospital of letting a reckless prodigy experiment on real people. When the decision came, it was wrapped in soft language that made it sound almost gentle. Administrative suspension pending investigation, temporary removal from surgical duties, for your own protection as well as the hospital's. It felt less like a punishment and more like a quiet exile. Her ID card, which had opened every restricted door in the building, was slid across the table and held there, waiting for her to give it back. The lanyard had left a faint groove on her neck over years of constant wear. Removing it felt like peeling off a part of her identity. By the time Lara stepped out of the conference room, the sky outside had shifted from a bright, clear blue to the muted tones of late afternoon. The city looked indifferent from up here, as if it couldn't care less about the drama unfolding behind glass walls. As she walked down the corridor, she caught a glimpse of herself in another window, hair pulled back in a bun that had survived a 20-hour shift, eyes framed by dark circles, the mark of a surgical mask still faintly etched across her cheeks. She looked like someone who had gone to war and been told the uniform didn't fit anymore. On the ground floor, she avoided the main entrance where the journalists still lingered like vultures waiting for fresh movement. Instead, she slipped out through a side door used by staff for smoke breaks, the scent of stale tobacco hanging in the air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. She already knew what it contained. Messages from colleagues who didn't know what to say, from her mother asking if the news was true, from unknown numbers sending threats disguised as moral outrage. Noise. Just noise. The only thing she hadn't expected was the email waiting in her inbox when she finally sat in her car and opened the screen, more out of reflex than intention. Among the flood of subject lines in all caps, one stood out in clean, simple letters. Dr. Lara Almeida, urgent inquiry regarding your procedure in OR 6. The sender was not a journalist, nor a lawyer, nor anyone from the hospital. It carried a domain she didn't recognize at first, something about international operations, a string of letters that didn't fit into the vocabulary of hospital politics. When she tapped it open and saw the logo at the bottom of the message, her breath halted halfway in her chest. It was not from the medical council, it was not from the press. It was from an organization that had no interest in hospital gossip or trending hashtags. The subject line repeated in her mind, sharper this time, an urgent inquiry, not about what she had done wrong, but about what she had done right. And at the bottom of the message, in small but unmistakable letters, was the name of the agency that had decided she was worth more than a scandal. Interpol. Lara stared at the email as if the letters might shift into something more familiar if she waited long enough. The hum of passing cars outside her window felt distant, strangely muffled, as though the world had slipped behind a thin layer of glass. Interpol didn't contact suspended residents from trauma surgery. They didn't send polite inquiries about hospital procedures. They dealt with fugitives, trafficking networks, weapons traces, and cross-border threats, not young doctors who'd spent the morning being crucified by local tabloids. The message was concise, almost understated, which somehow made it more unnerving. It referenced the patient she had operated on during the scandal, identified only by initials, as if even typing his full name carried risk. They asked for a preliminary account of the chest decompression she performed, the timeline, the anomalies she noticed on the scans before the surgery. They wanted to know if she could meet in person. No details, no justification, only urgency, wrapped in a tone that suggested her expertise wasn't just valued, it was critical. She read the email 3 times, her pulse steadily gaining force. The hospital had accused her of breaking protocol. The world had mocked her as the reckless young surgeon who didn't know her place. But Interpol, an agency with reach across nearly every border, believed she had seen something worth crossing oceans about. That thought alone pressed against her ribs like a new heartbeat, fragile but insistently alive. Before she could process more, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. It could be more harassment, another angry voice hiding behind a private line. But something in her gut, a sensation that felt strangely like a surgical instinct, told her to answer. A woman spoke. Her voice was steady, low, and disciplined, like someone accustomed to giving commands in unpredictable places. She addressed Lara by her full name, not as a question, but as confirmation. Then she explained that she was contacting Lara on behalf of Interpol's Medical Forensics Division. The patient from OR6, she said, was not who the hospital believed he was. His fingerprints were a match onto different international databases, both of which had been locked for years. There were inconsistencies between the hospital file and intelligence reports from another country. What Lara saw inside his chest, the vascular malformations she pushed through with improvisation and sheer instinct, were not natural and not accidental. There was a pause, long enough for Lara to hear her own breath grow shallow. She didn't trust her voice, so she stayed silent, waiting. The caller continued, explaining that the agency needed her expertise to identify a pattern found in several similar cases involving individuals with no traceable past, unexplained surgical alterations, and classified interests from multiple governments. Her decision in OR6, the cut she made, the method she used to decompress the thoracic cavity, without the proper instruments, those actions matched data from an ongoing investigation. They needed to talk, urgently. Lara tried to speak, but her words tangled with disbelief. She had spent the last 12 hours fighting to keep her career from collapsing. Now she was being told that her intuition during a chaotic trauma case aligned with an international manhunt. The dissonance felt impossible to reconcile. Was this real, or was her mind reaching for a lifeline after being dragged through so much humiliation? But the woman's tone allowed no space for fantasy. This wasn't a dream reaching down to save her. If anything, it was another storm, darker and infinitely more complex. Before hanging up, the caller gave her a time and an address, an old administrative wing of the airport that locals rarely noticed. And then, as if sensing Lara's hesitation, she added one final thing. The patient she had saved was now awake. Interpol had one chance to speak with him before others found out where he was, and they needed Lara there when they did. Her presence might be the only way to unravel the truth. The call ended. The silence in her car felt thick, almost heavy. She stared at her own reflection in the rearview mirror, her features lit by the fading glow of early evening. She looked tired, yes, but there was something else etched into her expression now, something quieter and sharper. A flicker of purpose beneath the exhaustion. In the hospital that morning, she had been treated like a liability, someone to hide, silence, and distance. But out here, in the space beyond institutional walls and public opinion, someone believed she saw something no one else had recognized. Someone believed she was necessary. Her hands trembled slightly as she started the car, not from fear, but from an adrenaline she couldn't quite contain. She didn't know what she was stepping into, or why a trauma case had put her on Interpol's radar. She didn't know why the patient had surgical evidence of something engineered, or why governments wanted him untraceable. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity: she couldn't ignore this. Not after everything she had lost today. Not after being stripped of everything she thought defined her. If there was a truth hidden inside that man's chest, she would find it. Not as a suspended doctor trying to salvage her reputation, but as someone who finally understood that her instincts, those raw, unpolished, deeply human instincts, might be worth more than anyone had ever told her. She pulled away from the curb, headlights slicing through the evening air, driving toward a meeting she couldn't fully comprehend but couldn't walk away from either. Behind her, the hospital's tall windows reflected a version of her that no longer existed. Ahead, something entirely different waited, something dangerous, something consuming, something that whispered that the worst day of her career might also be the start of her purpose. The airport's administrative wing looked abandoned from the outside. Faded paint, windows dim behind layers of dust, a parking lot cracked by years of heat. It was the kind of place people drove past without ever wondering what went on inside. Yet as Lara stepped through the side entrance, guided by a name badge printed just 10 minutes earlier, she felt the pressure of unseen eyes. Security cameras that shouldn't be working flickered faintly. The air carried the sterile cold of a place meant to be forgotten. A woman in a dark suit waited for her in the hallway. Her posture was sharp, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer her hand or her name, only a nod before turning and walking briskly ahead, forcing Lara to keep pace. The corridors were narrow, with walls that hummed quietly, as though machinery ran deep beneath the surface. At each door they passed, someone glanced up, assessing Lara with quick, mechanical precision. None of them looked surprised to see her. That unsettled her more than anything else. They reached a room at the far end of the wing. The woman opened the door without knocking, stepping aside so Lara could enter first. Inside, the lighting was low, soft enough to feel calming but bright enough to reveal every detail. Machines beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. Wires snaked from monitors to a bed where a man lay half-reclined, his chest wrapped in thick dressings that rose and fell with controlled effort. He looked young, maybe early 30s, but his face carried a kind of hardness that didn't match his age, the result of living in places where trust was a luxury. For a moment, Lara froze. She recognized him immediately, though the hospital had listed him under a false name. In the operating room, she had barely seen his face. Everything had been blood, urgency, collapsing lungs, and the frantic race to keep him alive. Now, with the chaos stripped away, she saw the details she had been too busy to absorb. A thin scar running along his jawline. The slight asymmetry of old fractures repaired outside of proper medical care, and an alert intelligence in his dark eyes that contradicted the fragile state of his body. A man in a gray jacket sat beside him, leaning forward with an intensity that suggested he wasn't here as a visitor. He rose the moment Lara stepped in, studying her with an expression that balanced suspicion and relief. There were no introductions between them, only a subtle acknowledgement that this meeting carried weight none of them fully understood. "You're the one who opened my chest," the patient said, his voice rough but steady, not an accusation, an observation. Lara nodded, the memory of that blood-filled moment flickering through her mind like a scene replayed in slow motion. His eyes lingered on her for a long second, and something shifted in his expression. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something like caution wrapped in respect. The man in gray adjusted a small recorder on the table. "We need to start," he said quietly, not directing the instructions at her, but including her in them. Lara moved closer, her steps careful, the instinct to assess his breathing, his posture, the pallor of his skin kicking in automatically. She didn't have her coat, her tools, or her hospital credentials anymore, yet the habits remained. Once a doctor, the body never let you forget. "What they told you?" the patient asked, turning his head to her. "About why you're here." "Not enough," she replied, and the honesty in her voice surprised even herself. He studied her again, as if deciding whether she could handle what he was about to say. He began slowly, the words coming with the effort of someone walking a tightrope between truth and danger. He explained that he had been living under a fabricated identity for nearly a decade, moving between countries without leaving digital traces. Every part of him, his records, his ID, his fingerprints had been erased or altered. He wasn't a criminal, he wasn't a spy. He was something harder to categorize, a witness who knew too much about a network that thrived in the shadows of legitimate institutions. A network that had ties to experimental medical research designed not to heal, but to disappear people who needed to be silenced. Lara's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments. The abnormal scar tissue she had noticed inside his chest now made sense. The vascular alterations, the strange density that didn't match typical anatomy, all signs of procedures done without proper regulation, maybe without consent. In the OR, she had trusted her instincts because nothing she saw made sense. Now she understood why. But the true revelation came when he mentioned the skin she had reviewed before the surgery, the skin she had flagged as inconsistent with reported trauma. She had been the only one to see certain anomalies, the only one who noted something irregular in the patterns. Interpol had accessed the hospital's internal logs. She had been the only person in the building who even recognized the pattern for what it might be: medical tampering. "You saw it," the man said, voice low. "You saw what they did to me. That's why you're here. You're the only one who looked close enough." The room grew heavier. Lara felt the shift in the air, like the moment before a storm when everything stands absolutely still. For months, maybe years, she had been buried in work-long shifts, impossible cases, exhaustion like a second skin. She had wondered if anyone noticed the way she fought for every patient, if anyone saw the difference between her quiet dedication and the noise of others claiming credit. At the hospital, they had humiliated her publicly, turning her into an example of what not to do. But here, in this dim, forgotten room near an airport, a man whose chest she had opened under chaos was telling her the opposite. "You're the reason I'm alive," he said, "and you might be the reason this ends." Those words hit her with more force than any insult she had received that morning. Responsibility, fear, purpose, they twisted together in her chest until she couldn't separate them from one another. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't trained for international conspiracies or hidden medical experiments. But the human body broken, altered, suffering was something she understood better than most. And this man, with his fragile breath and two sharp eyes, needed her more than the hospital that had thrown her away. Before she could speak, footsteps echoed in the hallway, several sets, fast and deliberate. The woman in the suit stiffened. The man in gray switched off the recorder with a swift, practiced motion. The patient's hand tightened around the bed rail. Someone outside knocked twice, not a polite knock, a warning. The woman opened the door only a few centimeters, enough to see who stood on the other side. For a moment she didn't breathe. Then she turned to Lara with urgency breaking through her composure. "We need to move, now." And for the first time since the day began, Lara felt something stronger than humiliation or fear. She felt the full weight of being necessary. The hallway outside had transformed. The quiet, brittle stillness that had filled the building was gone, replaced by a vibration in the air too controlled to be panic, too sharp to be coincidence. Lara stepped out behind the woman in the dark suit, her pulse beating a steady, heavy rhythm in her ears. Two men in plain clothes approached briskly from the far end of the corridor, each carrying a presence that suggested they rarely walked anywhere without purpose. Their eyes flicked over Lara, the patient's room, the half-open door. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their arrival alone said everything. The woman in the suit spoke in a lowered voice, her words clipped and fast. Security at the main gate flagged an unregistered vehicle. No plates, no transponder. It stopped for 20 seconds, then left. "They're checking the cameras now, but..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. In a place like this, nothing just happened. If a ghost car had appeared outside a classified medical briefing, someone was looking for something or someone. The man in gray emerged from the patient's room, closing the door with a deliberate, controlled movement. He didn't appear rattled, but there was a tension around his eyes that wasn't there before. "We're accelerating," he said simply. Then he turned to Lara, the weight of responsibility shifting unmistakably toward her. "You're coming with us." Lara's breath caught. She hadn't expected those words, not yet, not so abruptly, not while her feet were still planted on a corridor that smelled faintly of dust and cold machinery. Everything in her life had been spiraling for the past 24 hours, but the hospital, the board meeting, the cameras, they all felt strangely small now, like scenes from a different story she had stepped out of without noticing. "Why me?" she asked, the question leaving her mouth before she could restrain it. It wasn't insecurity, it was disbelief. She was a suspended trauma surgeon, not a forensic expert, not an intelligence officer. She had saved a man's life using instinct and training, but what they were asking, whatever they were preparing for, belonged to a world built on shadows and precision. The man in gray met her gaze without flinching. "Because you saw what none of us did. And he trusts you." He nodded toward the closed door behind him, the patient whose breathing she had saved with a cut made in desperation and clarity. "We might get one chance to question him before he's moved. We can't risk losing that." The group began moving down the corridor as a single unit. Lara followed, not because she had decided, but because something inside her refused to stay behind. They reached a reinforced door at the end of the hallway that required two separate badges and a fingerprint scan to unlock. The woman in the suit typed a code she shielded with her body. The lock disengaged with a sharp click that echoed down the darkened hall. Inside was a small briefing room, no windows, no decorations, only a large screen on the wall and a table with scattered documents, some blurred with ink designed to vanish under the wrong temperature. The atmosphere felt heavier here, as though secrets had a physical presence. One of the plainclothes operatives closed the door behind them, sealing off the corridor from view. On the screen, a paused video feed showed the patient from several hours earlier, lying unconscious in a hospital bed. But his chart, displayed beside the image, was nothing like the file she had been shown at the hospital. Multiple identities, multiple birthplaces. Each record contradicted the last, and under medical history, entire sections were marked with a red stripe labeled Restricted Classics. The operative nearest the screen pressed a key, resuming the footage. Lara watched as the man unconscious, intubated, pale with blood loss, twitched beneath the sheets. Not the twitch of pain or involuntary reflex, but something more controlled, almost trained. Then, without warning, a streak of muscle tension rippled across his torso, as though his body fought the sedation itself. That, the operative said quietly, is what alerted us. No civilian subject should be able to override deep sedation. Not unless something was changed inside him. Lara swallowed, her mind involuntarily replaying the sensation of cutting through his tissue during the emergency thoracotomy. The strange density, the fibers that didn't respond to clamps the way they should. The feeling that she wasn't just treating trauma but fighting something engineered. So what exactly was done to him? Lara asked, hearing the dryness in her own voice. We don't know, the woman replied, but we know the modifications match 3 other unidentified bodies found in different countries. Medical alterations, structural adjustments, all consistent with procedures done by a group operating outside any legal jurisdiction. Human trafficking, Lara asked. Worse, the man in gray answered. A network using medical experimentation to erase identities. To make people disappear without killing them. They modify them until they no longer exist as themselves, not legally, not physiologically. And the man you saved is their first surviving witness. The room seemed to tilt almost imperceptibly, as if the truth they were circling was too heavy for the walls to contain. Lara felt a chill crawl across her skin, the kind that came not from fear but from understanding something she wished she could unlearn. A life saved in the OR had become a thread pulled from a fabric no one wanted her to touch. And you think they tracked him here, she said. We know they did, one operative replied. The vehicle didn't leave, it circled. Someone was looking for confirmation that he's still alive. The implications sharpened into something terrifyingly clear. If they found him, they could erase him again. If they found her, she was the only surgeon who had seen inside the work they had done. She was evidence. The man in gray leaned in slightly, his voice low. We're moving him to a secure site, and we need you to examine him there. Whatever was implanted or modified in his chest, you're the only surgeon who's navigated through it and kept him alive. Lara stared at him, thoughts spinning with a mixture of clarity and shock. Hours earlier she had been standing in a boardroom, stripped of her badge, accused of recklessness. Now she was being asked to step into an operation that crossed borders, laws, and every boundary she had ever known. She hadn't chosen this path, but something about it felt inevitable, as if saving him had dragged her into the truth whether she agreed or not. Before she could respond, an alarm echoed softly through the corridor, a muted siren, barely audible but unmistakably urgent. One operative pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece, his eyes darkened. They're inside the perimeter. The woman in the suit looked at Lara, and for the first time her voice carried something raw. We leave now. And in that instant, the decision was no longer hers to make. They moved as a single current through the narrow hallways, the tension around them tightening with each step, and Lara felt her world compress into the rhythm of her own breathing. The alarm wasn't loud, but its presence threaded through the walls like a pulse, steady, low, and insistent. It suggested something far more dangerous than noise, an intrusion sophisticated enough to slip past layered defenses designed to keep the outside world from ever knowing this place existed. Lara didn't need an explanation. The urgency in the operative's movements told her everything she needed to know. Whoever had come searching wasn't improvising. They knew exactly what they wanted and where to look. The woman in the suit led the group toward a service corridor that cut behind the administrative wing. The fluorescent lights flickered as they passed, casting brief, disorienting shadows on the walls. Lara stayed close, her thoughts spiraling through what the patient had revealed, what she had seen inside his chest, and the chilling realization that the same people who had altered him might now be close enough to touch the building's outer locks. Her humiliation at the hospital felt like a faded bruise compared to this growing sense of peril. She was no longer defending her reputation. She was running from a truth capable of swallowing her whole. The corridor opened into a loading bay where 2 armored vehicles waited with engines low and heavy. A handful of operatives stood by the open doors, each one carrying themselves with a quiet readiness that didn't require words. Lara was guided toward the first vehicle, but as she reached the metal step, a distant sound cut through the air, dull, rhythmic, almost like a mechanical heartbeat. She turned instinctively, scanning the darkness beyond the floodlights, and a cold realization settled into her bones. It wasn't machinery, it wasn't coincidence. It was movement approaching, organized, and paired with the kind of silence that belonged to people trained to slip through shadows without being seen. The operatives reacted instantly, their formation shifting with a precision that suggested rehearsed scenarios for moments exactly like this. Weapons were raised without panic, eyes narrowed toward the edges of the lot. The woman in the suit pressed a hand to her earpiece, her expression tightening as she received information Lara wasn't privy to. The man in gray stepped between Lara and the open expanse of the bay, shielding her in a way that felt deliberate. Not protective, more like he understood she had become too essential to risk losing in the first minutes of whatever this confrontation might be. They hustled her inside the vehicle, and the door slammed shut with a reverberating finality. Lara's heartbeat thudded against her ribs as the interior lights dimmed. She could hear the muffled commands outside, quick and clipped, but the words blended into the heavy hum of the engine. The patient was in the second vehicle, guarded by a team with orders far stricter than hers. She imagined him lying there, fragile but holding knowledge that had reshaped her entire understanding of what she had walked into. His survival wasn't just a medical victory, it was a threat to people powerful enough to breach a secure perimeter without warning. As the vehicle lurched forward, accelerating toward the secondary exit, the world outside blurred into streaks of shadow and industrial light. Lara steadied herself against the seat, her breath catching in the tight space. She felt the weight of every unanswered question pressing against her. Who were the people tracking him? What had been implanted inside his chest? Why had someone chosen to erase a man instead of killing him? And why, after everything, did her instincts in the OR lead her to this moment, inside a reinforced vehicle moving at high speed through a forgotten part of the city? The roads beyond the airport grounds were empty, too empty, as if someone had anticipated their escape route. The man in gray leaned forward, eyes scanning a digital map mounted on the console, and his voice dropped into a tone that carried tension even without raised volume. The map displayed the perimeter in blinking red lines, and several points glowed with static interference where the surveillance system had been neutralized. Lara realized then that they weren't just being chased, they were being herded, maneuvered through channels someone else had designed. The thought made her pulse spike. For a moment, the vehicle jolted sharply to the left, forcing Lara's shoulder against the seat. The driver cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel as the tires skidded across uneven pavement. Something had appeared in their path, a spike strip or a barricade. She couldn't see which, but it forced them to divert toward a service tunnel beneath an overpass. The man in gray glanced back at her, his expression unreadable but focused, and it struck her that he was watching not just for danger, but for her reaction. She wondered if he was gauging her resilience, testing whether the young doctor who made a life-or-death incision without waiting for permission could handle the reality of what she had become part of. When they finally cleared the tunnel and emerged onto a quieter road, the woman in the suit exhaled slowly, the tension in her posture loosening by a fraction. They were buying time, not safety. The enemy was still out there, following a trail they hadn't managed to cover. Lara pressed her hand to her chest, grounding herself, reminding herself that fear didn't negate capability. She had stepped into impossible moments before, inside operating rooms where silence can kill faster than noise, where uncertainty demands action, not retreat. This was the same, only larger, darker, and hidden from the world. The woman in the suit finally spoke, her tone stripped of its earlier formality. "We'll reach the secure site soon. When we do, you'll need to examine him again. Whatever modifications they made to his chest, we need to know if there's anything that could compromise him during transport or interrogation." Lara nodded, the responsibility settling around her like a cloak she didn't ask for but understood she needed to wear. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't reacting to accusations or defending against headlines. She was stepping into a role carved by the very instincts that had kept a stranger alive. And now, that stranger's life was intertwined with a danger she could no longer ignore. As the vehicle sped deeper into the night, Lara looked out the small reinforced window, watching the city fade into blurred shapes and darkened silhouettes. She had no idea where they were taking her, what she would face, or who was waiting on the other end of this journey. But she knew with absolute clarity that this was no longer about a scandal or a suspension. This was about a truth powerful enough to chase her across borders. The drive stretched into the outskirts, where the city dissolved into long, silent roads bordered by warehouses and abandoned industrial yards. Lara watched the landscape shift through the reinforced window, the night pressing thickly against the glass. The further they traveled, the clearer it became that this place, wherever they were going, was meant to be invisible. No passing cars, no streetlights, no homes. only the hum of engines and the mechanical rhythm of wind scraping across concrete. When the vehicles finally slowed, they rolled into a compound surrounded by high fencing and motionless floodlights. It didn't look like a government facility or anything officially marked. It looked like a building someone wanted: forgotten gray stone, narrow windows, a structure without a past or a future. The vehicle eased to a stop at a side entrance, and the door opened with a hydraulic hiss that cut through the otherwise total quiet. Lara stepped out into cold air that carried the faint scent of metal and dust. The operatives formed a perimeter immediately, their movements synchronized and deliberate, as if every step had been rehearsed. The second vehicle pulled up behind them, its doors opening to reveal the patient being transported with medical precision monitors attached, 4 lines secured, his breathing stronger than earlier but still shallow. He looked conscious enough to register movement but too weak to speak. Even so, something in his expression sharpened the moment he saw the building, a flicker of recognition or dread that passed too quickly to interpret. They escorted Lara indoors, through a narrow corridor lined with reinforced panels. The interior was functional to the point of bleakness: metal doors, faint humming from ventilation shafts, the practiced silence of a place meant to minimize human presence. Every footstep echoed lightly, swallowed by the walls. Lara tried to steady her pulse, reminding herself that she had walked into worse operating rooms with chaos leaking through the walls, emergency bays filled with grief and noise. But this silence felt different, too absolute, too watchful. They led her into a makeshift medical suite, clean, organized, but improvised. Equipment she recognized stood beside devices she didn't. The patient was placed on an exam bed under bright overhead lights, and for a moment, as Lara moved closer, everything else in the room fell away. She wasn't thinking about operatives, secure sites, perimeter breaches. Her mind shifted into the instinctive clarity she found only in proximity to a fragile life. His chest rose unevenly beneath the dressings, the strain evident in the subtle quiver of his ribs. She approached, her hands steadying in that familiar way they always did before assessing a trauma case. She removed the top layer of gauze, revealing the line of sutures she had placed during the emergency thoracotomy, darker now against healing tissue. The skin around it was warm but not infected, and his vital signs, displayed on a nearby monitor, remained stable. She pressed her fingertips lightly along his ribs, assessing the structural integrity, mapping the recovery of the collapsed lung. And then she caught at a subtle rigidity beneath the tissue, a line that didn't belong to bone or scar or any reconstruction she had performed. Something embedded, something foreign, something designed. Her breath hitched. She pressed deeper, following the irregular border with clinical precision. Whatever was inside him wasn't a medical implant. It wasn't shaped like anything used in repair or reconstruction. It felt purposeful in a way that made her stomach tighten. Artificial, embedded in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. The man in gray stepped closer, reading her expression the way only someone trained to recognize silent revelations could. "You found something," he said, not a question, but a confirmation of what her face already betrayed. Lara didn't answer immediately. She kept her hands on the patient's chest, tracing the foreign structure beneath the skin. It felt like a thin plate with segmented edges, anchored in a way that suggested surgical precision far beyond emergency medicine. She couldn't identify the material, but she could identify its intent. It was designed to stay hidden until someone who knew exactly what to look for opened the body. A revelation struck her so sharply she almost froze. She had been the first to cut into it. The first to touch it. The first to survive touching it. The patient stirred beneath her hands, his eyes flicking open with a clouded awareness. He looked at her with something between apology and urgency, as if he had hoped she wouldn't discover this yet. His fingers twitched toward hers, reaching weakly, not to stop her but to warn her, though she didn't know of what. "This wasn't meant to be found," Lara said finally, her voice low, steady, but carrying the weight of the truth she had just uncovered. "Whatever they did to him, it wasn't just structural. This is something else." The operatives exchanged looks heavy with implications. The woman in the suit leaned forward, her composure cracking by a fraction. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. Lara swallowed, keeping her hand pressed firmly against the foreign shape. "It could be, but not in the way you're thinking." She didn't want to say the next words aloud, but she knew she had to. "I think it's a tracking device." The room shifted, not physically, but in the way tension alters atmosphere. The air thickened, the silence tightened, and for a moment no one breathed. It explained everything: the breaches, the ghost vehicle, the perimeter incursions. He hadn't led them there. He had been followed the entire time. The man in gray turned sharply toward one of the operatives near the door, issuing commands too fast for Lara to track. The woman in the suit moved toward a control panel on the wall, her fingers racing over switches and secure lines. Above them, the lights flickered, as if the building itself responded to the new threat. Lara stayed where she was, her hand still on the patient's chest, feeling the faint, steady beat beneath the foreign shape. The realization cut into her with cold certainty. The thing inside him had been active since before he reached the hospital. It had been active while she saved his life. It had been active as they moved him across the city. And it was active now, inside a building they thought was safe. Her voice came out quieter, heavier, shaped by the gravity of what she understood. They already know we're here. For a moment, no one moved. The truth pressed down on the room with a weight that felt almost physical, as though the walls themselves understood the danger pulsing inside the man on the table. Lara kept her hand over the foreign structure embedded in his chest, the faint vibration beneath her fingertips confirming a threat no bigger than a card, yet capable of collapsing every layer of security around them. The lights overhead dimmed, then steadied, flickering with the nervous energy of a building sensing intrusion. Outside the medical suite, footsteps rushed in coordinated patterns, the operatives shifting from routine to high alert. Doors opened sharply. Metal slid against metal. The entire compound awakened with a hum of tension that echoed through the vents. Even without hearing the commands being thrown across secure channels, Lara understood the shift. This wasn't a drill, and it wasn't temporary. Something was coming for them, something relentless enough to follow the signal buried inside the patient's ribcage. The man in gray returned to her side, moving with a composed urgency. He had shed whatever calm detachment he carried earlier. His posture had changed into something sharper, more prepared, the stance of someone who had expected this outcome but hoped it would never arrive. His focus flicked from the monitor to the rising tension in the patient's breathing, then to the rigid outline beneath the skin, and finally back to Lara. She said nothing, letting the weight of what she had already revealed speak for itself. The patient's breath rattled, the movement of air catching on a pain he tried to suppress. His body strained as though fighting to enemies his injuries and the truth embedded within them. Lara steadied him with one hand on his shoulder and another over the device, grounding him despite the tremors building in his frame. He wasn't speaking, but his eyes carried a silent plea, something between apology and warning, and it made her chest tighten with a feeling far too complicated for the moment. The woman in the suit entered with the tablet clutched in her hand, her expression altered by a shade of tension Lara hadn't seen before. She explained the situation without theatrics: multiple heat signatures at the perimeter, coordinated movement, no identification markers on any of the approaching units. Whoever they were, they had erased themselves before reaching the compound. The tracking device wasn't simply alerting someone to their location, it was guiding something far more calculated, closing in with precision. Lara listened as she pressed her palm deeper into the man's sternum, the foreign edges beneath his skin sharp against her touch. She didn't need to be told how little time they had. She could feel it. The vibrations in the device seemed stronger now, as though recognizing proximity, like a heartbeat accelerating under stress. Each pulse carried the possibility of detection, each second a countdown she couldn't quantify but felt with absolute clarity. The operatives around them shifted into action, voices low and controlled. Equipment was loaded with efficiency, cables detached, monitors folded into compact forms. The room transformed from a medical space into a temporary battlefield command within seconds. No one argued, no one hesitated. The only constant in the chaos was Lara, her fingers still holding pressure over the hidden device, as if stopping her touch would allow it to scream their location into the night. When the transport gurney arrived, she helped reposition the patient despite the tremors coursing through him. His muscles clenched beneath her hands, his breath hitched, sweat forming along his hairline. Lara leaned close enough to feel the warmth of his strained exhale, guiding his breathing with the kind of calm she had used in countless trauma rooms. He responded with a slow, shaky rhythm, grounding himself in her presence as the operatives prepared to move him. The building groaned as something shifted in the distance, metal under strain, a lock responding to external force. The operatives exchanged looks heavy with urgency. The woman in the suit tapped rapidly on her tablet, then announced that they had less than a minute before they lost full control of the compound's defenses. Even the reinforced walls would mean little if the enemy had the technology to breach from within. As they transferred the patient onto the gurney, Lara kept pace, refusing to step back. The man in gray didn't question it. He simply positioned himself between her and the door, preparing for the next phase of escape with the ease of someone accustomed to fleeing danger rather than engaging it. They moved through the corridor in coordinated stride, the dim overhead lights flickering in sync with the failing grid. Each hallway they crossed felt narrower, the sound of distant impacts vibrating through the structure, a reminder that the threat was no longer theoretical. Somewhere behind them, a door crashed open, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the walls like a warning shot. Lara didn't look back, but she felt the shift in atmosphere, the way tension took on a sharper edge. The operatives tightened their formation around the gurney, shielding it with bodies trained to move without thought or hesitation. The man in gray spoke only once, his voice low, steady, and carrying an urgency that needed no elaboration. "They're not here to capture him." Lara absorbed the meaning in silence. They were here to erase the witness, to erase the evidence, to erase the one person who had survived what others hadn't. And, she realized with a cold clarity that tightened her throat, they might be here to erase her too. They pushed deeper into the compound, the walls trembling with distant collisions as the perimeter finally buckled. The operatives closed ranks around the gurney, guiding it with a kind of silent desperation that told Lara how thin the line between survival and disaster had become. Every step felt measured against the thrum of the tracking device beneath the patient's ribs, its vibrations now faint but insistent, like a pulse counting down to whatever force hunted them through the night. Lara walked beside the gurney, one hand gripping the rail, the other hovering over the dressing on his chest as if sheer proximity could shield the small, dangerous truth embedded beneath his skin. His breathing had grown ragged, the strain of movement pushing his already fragile equilibrium toward the edge. She didn't speak. There was no reassurance that wouldn't ring hollow, but she stayed close enough that he could feel her presence, steady and unwavering amid the chaos. The corridor twisted toward an emergency exit reinforced with a layered locking system. The woman in the suit typed rapidly on a portable console, overriding lines of code as the building's internal defenses flickered between control and collapse. The operatives formed a protective half-circle around them as the locks disengaged one by one, a metallic click, then another, then a deep mechanical thud that shook dust loose from the ceiling panels. Each sound seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the compound itself understood it was releasing something it was never meant to shelter for long. They pushed into a secondary loading tunnel buried beneath the structure. The air was colder here, tinged with the scent of concrete and machine oil. A dark SUV waited at the far end, engine running, headlights dimmed to slits. The gurney was maneuvered with practiced efficiency, the operatives guiding it into the back with only the friction of the wheels breaking the heavy quiet. Lara climbed in after them without hesitation. She didn't wait for permission, didn't wonder if she belonged. The patient's hand brushed against her sleeve as she sat beside him, and though his eyes were barely open, there was a flicker of awareness in them, one that told her he knew how close they were to losing everything he had endured to survive. The doors slammed shut, the SUV lurched forward, the tunnel walls rushed past in a blur of gray and shadow, the vehicle navigating the narrow space with precision that bordered on reckless. The man in gray sat in the front passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the map glowing faintly on a handheld device, recalculating their route with every shift in the compound's heat signature. Behind him, the woman in the suit monitored a series of encrypted channels, her expression tight as information poured in faster than she could relay it. Lara focused on the patient, watching the rise and fall of his chest under the strained bandages. His breaths came shallow, punctuated by tremors that rippled along his ribs. She rested her hand lightly against his sternum, feeling both his effort to stay conscious and the unnerving stillness of the foreign device embedded beneath the bone. She wondered how long it had been inside him, how many nights he had slept without knowing he carried something that turned him into a beacon for the people who wanted him erased. Her throat tightened at the thought that he might have lived for years as a hunted shadow without ever understanding why. The SUV swerved sharply left, and Lara braced herself as the patient's body jolted. The driver muttered something under his breath, the tension in his hands mirrored in the way the steering wheel trembled against every shift of the road. The tunnel's exit appeared ahead as a faint circle of night, a darker darkness waiting to swallow them whole. The moment the SUV shot out into open air, the tires screeched against wet pavement, and the world outside unfolded into a maze of abandoned lots and unmarked service roads. "Multiple contacts behind us," the woman said, her voice low but controlled. "We need to reach the outer grid before they triangulate again." Lara didn't look back. She didn't need the confirmation of headlights or shadows to feel the presence closing in. It was in the tightening air, the urgency that filled the vehicle, the faint tremor beneath her palm where the device pulsed like a quiet warning. The patient turned his head slightly toward her, effort lining the corners of his eyes. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but the way he searched her face made something inside Lara sharpen with a force she didn't expect. This wasn't just about medicine anymore. It wasn't about scandal or humiliation or the hospital that had turned its back on her. It was about a truth she had stumbled into and a life she refused to abandon simply because the world around them had decided he didn't deserve to exist. The SUV accelerated into the night, engines roaring as they pushed through the last unlit stretch before the outer roads. Somewhere behind them, movement shifted in the darkness, vehicles or shadows or forces too silent to be anything ordinary. The air itself felt different, heavy with pursuit, as though the night had teeth and was closing around them with deliberate intent. Lara leaned closer to the patient, keeping her voice low, steady, shaped by the resolve building inside her. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered, not as a promise, but as a decision she had already made. The SUV surged forward, and the darkness followed.